Welcome everybody to the Waking Space. Today we're going to be talking about thinking clearly, also called critical thinking. This is just going to be an introduction, so we're going to go over parts of arguments, things like that, but it does get more in depth, so if you think you already know this stuff, hang with it for a bit. I bet you'll learn something. So first off, why bother? Well, there's a lot of misinformation out there in the world. Learning how to think clearly can get us to wade through the muck so we understand what's really going on and not make mistakes. So let's go through some basic terms here. A claim is a statement of belief or opinion. So if I say water is my favorite drink, that's a claim. It's not yet an argument, right? I haven't provided any reason to why I believe water is better than, say, soda. If I say I really like water because it's healthier than soda and has 0 calories, now I've made myself an argument. I made a claim and then I supported that claim. So there's two parts of an argument then. There's a premise, this is the claim that supports, and the conclusion, what you're actually trying to get at. This needs support from premises. So you can kind of think of it like a triangle where all the premises actually support the conclusion. So an example of this would be if I thought that they should make rectangular peanut butter jars so that your knuckles didn't get all peanut buttery at the end of the jar. I just made an argument. I have a conclusion, they should make rectangular peanut butter jars, and then I have a premise, so that way your hands don't get dirty. So I made an argument. Here's another example. I really don't think we should be putting people in jail for misdemeanors. Our prisons are already over capacity. Now how do we tell what is the conclusion and what's the premise here? An easy way to tell the conclusion is, what am I really trying to get at? What's the overarching message that I'm trying to say? Well, that would be the first sentence. The premise is what supports that conclusion, so it would be the second sentence. It's the reason why I think the first sentence is true. Now there's two types of arguments that I'm going to cover. The first kind is called deductive arguments. In this case, if the premises are true, the conclusion absolutely has to be true. There's no other way about it. Let's look at an example. If Amy lives in New York, then she lives in the USA. Okay, if the premises are true, doesn't the conclusion have to follow 100%? If Amy really does live inside New York, right, inside the middle circle, doesn't she have to live within the USA, the bigger circle? Yeah, because the definition of New York is a state that is in the USA. So it's by the definitions that this is true. Another example, duck is a D word because it starts with D. So my conclusion is, hey guys, duck is a D word. And you're like, what? Tell me why. And I'm like, oh, because it starts with D. And you're like, oh, okay. Doesn't it have to be true that if it does start with D, it is a D word? Yeah, because the definition of a D word is something that starts with D. That's the power of deductive arguments. If the premises are true, the conclusion is going to follow 100%. Now, deductive arguments have a couple qualities. One of them is validity. You might have heard people say that. Well, that's a valid argument. What does that mean? It actually doesn't mean much. An argument is said to be valid when the premises prove the conclusion to be true. So all validity is really saying is that the argument makes sense. Here's an example. Beethoven is younger than Hitler, therefore Hitler is older than Beethoven. Now if we forget what we know in the real world and we just look at these things, if they were true, if Beethoven was younger than Hitler, would the conclusion follow that Hitler is older? Yeah. So this is actually a valid argument, even though we know it's not true in real life. So the argument's still valid even though it's not true. So validity is just a way of saying, yeah, the argument makes sense, but we haven't actually reality checked it yet. Now to see if an argument is sound, which is the second quality of deductive arguments, we have to go out and see if it's true in the real world. First, it has to be valid, right? It has to make sense. Then, to be sound, it really is true in the world. So we actually go out in the world and check. The Earth is smaller than Saturn, therefore Saturn is larger than the Earth. First, we check for validity. If the Earth was smaller than Saturn, wouldn't it follow that Saturn is larger than the Earth? Yeah. Okay, it makes sense, so it's a valid argument. But that's not good enough. Let's go out and check in the real world. So we get our telescopes and we look. Oh yeah, Earth is smaller than Saturn. So it's valid and it's really true. Now we have a sound argument, which is ideal. So let's do a little practice here. All creatures with wings can fly. First premise. Second premise. Well, penguins have wings. This little line means therefore. Therefore, penguins can fly. That's my conclusion. all creatures with wings can fly. Penguins got them, so penguins can fly. So let's check for validity and soundness. Is it valid? Well, if all creatures with wings could fly, and penguins did have wings, wouldn't it follow that penguins can fly? Sure, absolutely. Conclusions follow, if they were true. Now we check for soundness. We go out and we take a penguin and we chuck him off a cliff and see if he flies. No, it doesn't work. Penguins can't fly in real life, so it's not sound. Here's another example, a classic one. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Let's check for validity. Is it valid? Does it follow? If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, is he mortal? Yeah, that follows. That makes sense. Then we check for soundness. We go out in the real world and say, hey, was he a real man? Was he mortal? Yep, he was a dude. He died, so it's sound. All right, one last one. This one's kind of tricky. If Buster walked to the game, then he didn't drive to the game. That's the first premise. Buster didn't drive to the game, therefore Buster walked to the game. If you look at that for a second, you might want to pause it and just try to check that logic out. Is it valid? If he walked to the game, then he didn't drive to the game. Buster didn't drive to the game, therefore he walked? Actually, that's not valid, right? It doesn't actually follow. He could have rode his bike, he could have taken a scooter, right? All kinds of things. Now the second type of argument are called inductive, and you're going to sense the difference right when we get into an example. In inductive arguments, if the premises are true, the conclusion might be true, or it probably is true, depending on the strength of the premises. Here's an example. Bill lives in Buffalo, New York. He must shovel a lot in winter. Now you might be reading that and going, yeah, that makes sense. But is it like a deductive argument where if Bill really lives in Buffalo, New York, he has to absolutely 100% shovel a lot in winter? No, right? There's other considerations. It doesn't have to be true, but it can, depending on the strength. And in this case, Bill, sure, he lives in Buffalo, New York, lots of snow. He probably does, right? But it's not 100%. So I want you to feel the difference between inductive and deductive. More examples will help. George is a man. George is 85 years old. Therefore, George cannot run a 4-minute mile. Already you should be like, that doesn't feel deductive. I mean, even if he is a man and he's 85, there's this slight possibility that he could run that fast, right? As long as there's this possibility, well then we're not in deductive land, we're in inductive land. Is the conclusion true? Possibly. It's got good probability based on what we know about guys when they're 85, right? But it's not a certainty. So it's not deductive, it's inductive. Let's take a real life example here. Dumbbell training is inherently safe. I've never observed a torn muscle or any other serious injury resulting from the proper use of dumbbells. All right, what's the conclusion here? Oh, dumbbell training is safe. And what's his reasoning? What's his premise? Well, he's never seen anybody get injured by it. So you already should be thinking, okay, this is not deductive, this must be inductive. And what evidence is he using? His observations. Is this strong or weak? Well, depends on who he is. It depends on how many times he's observed people use dumbbells, right? He could bulk up this argument saying, well, I'm a doctor of medicine, or I'm a personal trainer and I've been doing this for 40 years and I've never seen anybody get injured. Okay, now it's a little bit stronger. Is it perfect? Is it like a deductive argument? No. Okay, he's basing all his evidence on his own observations. One person's observations don't make a thing true, no matter how many times they've actually seen it. Here's another example. A blue-eyed baby has DNA. A brown-eyed baby has DNA. A green-eyed baby has DNA. Therefore, all babies have DNA. Now, to actually gauge the strength of this argument, you have to take away what you already know, that humans, yeah, we all have this stuff called DNA. I mean, imagine DNA was replaced with a third ear. Oh, I found this baby and he had a third ear. I found another baby and he has a third ear. One more baby and they also have a third ear. Therefore, all babies have 3 ears. You'd be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. So going along with this, with inductive arguments, the number of observations really does matter. He's only got 3 observations here, just 3 babies, and he's basing his entire conclusion on all of that. So we know that this is not deductive. All right, let's push inductive reasoning to its limits and really start seeing its downsides. Here's a classic example. All swans that have ever been observed in the history of the earth have been white. Therefore, all swans are white. Now that's a lot of observations, right? All swans that have ever been observed, that is a ton of observations. But is it deductive? There's still this chance, right? There's still this chance. Now this brings up a great point, right? It's really strong, great number of observations, but what happens if we observe one black swan? What does it do to this argument? It absolutely destroys it, right? Because only one instance of the opposite could destroy this argument. Why? Because he said all. This person said all swans are white. That's his conclusion. But actually, one black swan totally negates his argument. Let's drive this home even further. Consider a turkey that is fed every day. Every single feeding will firm up the bird's belief that's the general rule of life, to be fed every day by friendly members of the human race looking out for its best interest. On the afternoon of the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, something unexpected will happen to the turkey. It will incur a revision of belief. So this story tells us actually a lot of the weaknesses of inductive reasoning. I mean, the turkey had this idea that humans were great. Why? Because the evidence it was using was all the past previous days. But that actually isn't good enough, right? That's not deductive. In fact, his confidence increased every single day. Why wouldn't it, right? It knows nothing else. And the feeling of safety was at its peak when he was actually at the most danger. So the history of a process of 1,000 days actually tells us absolutely nothing about day 1001, which gets a little crazy, right? I mean, think about the sun rising. Well, we all think it's going to rise tomorrow. Why? Well, because it's always risen. We've only ever seen it rise. That's not deductive thinking, that's inductive thinking. There's a chance, albeit a small one, it might not. That's the problem with inductive reasoning. We have to be very careful. The more observations, the better, and our argument will get stronger, but we're never going to be at that deductive level where we can say, absolutely, this is going to happen. What about persuasion? Are those the same thing as arguments? No, not always. Persuasion is attempting to cause a person to believe something, and that's going to be our next topic. It can come in the form of an argument, but it doesn't have to. Take flattery, for example. Hey, you look great today. Can I borrow $5? Well, there's no actual argument there, right? So that's persuasion, but not an argument. Or propaganda. Well, fill in the blank is the greatest country in the world. Support the wars overseas, right? This would be called nationalism. That's not exactly an argument, right? I mean, it's just a couple statements. So we'll get into more of this with persuasion and rhetoric. So thinking clearly can't be stressed enough. Here at the Waking Space, we're going to cover many difficult topics that are going to require some deep critical thinking skills. We have to get to the bottom of it. What's really going on? What's the root cause of these problems? And a lot of information out there is going to try and manipulate us, trying to trick us to believe what it says is true. We have to sift through all that using these critical thinking skills. Alright, that was just dipping our toes into thinking clearly. Look out for part 2. Thanks for listening.